Okay, I'm going to call Professor Beki Ngomezulu to the front to do our welcome.
Thanks. Good evening, colleagues. I'm notorious for a lot of things. So I've learned to write down the things that I'm going to say so that next time I don't say I was misquoted. I heard Motlante denying that he once said the ANC must be allowed to die and then it will resurrect. And now he's saying, no, I was misquoted. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for honoring this invitation. I'll be very brief because I'm not a speaker, I'm not a guest editor, I'm not anything. I'm just a local boy. So my job then from Christy is to do just that, to welcome you, so that at least you know that you are welcome here. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to my colleague, Professor Christy van der Westhuizen, for affording me the opportunity to welcome you all to this very important session. Although I'm currently busy with the preparations for the elections, this is one event I could not miss, given its importance and the book that is being launched, which speaks directly to issues of democracy, and is also meant to remind us about the need for democratic consolidation and making sure that we assist in ensuring that our nascent democracy grows as quickly as humanly possible. I always hold the belief that a university that does not prioritize research is as good as dead. We cannot call ourselves a university and we don't prioritize research. We all know the saying that you either publish or perish. And therefore, it's very important when we have events like this which speak to that particular idea. Conventionally, academics are expected to perform in 4 key areas. One is teaching, the second one is research, the third one is administration, where we participate in different administrative bodies, and then of course the last one is community engagement. It puzzles me then when some of our colleagues will tell you that you don't have to be worried that much about research. The danger there is that even if you are a good teacher or a good lecturer, if you don't conduct research, then you end up teaching students in 2024 using notes that were written in 1995. And you may end up talking about Soviet Union when there is none, talk about East Germany, because the notes are outdated. So research assists us in that regard then. So before I sit down, Christy, it's very important then to emphasize a couple of things. One of which is that transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity are important, simply because we no longer work in silos, given the fact that even some of the funders are now more amenable to funding projects that are interdisciplinary. The nature of the book that we are launching today speaks exactly to that, given the fact that it brought scholars from different disciplines, but then they all had one goal in mind, and this is the outcome that we are celebrating today. Therefore, we are on the right track. At Conrad, we're a small staff contingent, but then we try as much as possible to fit into the university's research agenda. And this is one of the things that we're doing. Prof. Christy van der Westhuizen leads the research unit. There is Mr. Stirman who leads the engagement unit. But our take is that you cannot have engagement events that are moved away from research. So research should inform everything that we do. So ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy yourself and have a great time. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Beki for that welcome, and a very important reminder about the role of research in the university context. Ultimately, our universities are vital sources of intellectual insight through which we can actually also chart a way out of difficult moments like we are in right now in South Africa, but not just in South Africa, actually globally. If we look at democracy is really in a fix. This book that we will be discussing today has its genesis in a conference on democracy that we hosted in 2021 with the title "The State We're In: Democracies, Fractures, Fixes and Futures." And the whole point about that was actually that democracy, as we can see worldwide, is embattled. We've got various forces out to radically undermine democracy and to delegitimize democracy, both from the left and from the right. And so the idea of that with that conference at the time was because the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism Democracy is particularly concerned with democracy, of course, given its title, was to actually address and to really dig into better understanding why are we seeing this kind of onslaught on democracy in our own country, but also across the continent. There's been a democratic backsliding across the African continent as well, and the rest of the world. So just to say that this is our third launch. We had a launch at the University of the Western Cape last week. That was actually really wonderful. We're trying to feature all of our authors. We've got a wonderful group of authors from across South Africa, but also further afield. We've got an author he's based in Qatar at the moment, but also spending a lot of time in Germany with the name Rashid Boutayeb. We've got another author on what we call the European periphery, Slovakia, writing on the military quarantine that Roma communities were placed in during COVID times in Slovakia. Svetluza Shirova is her name. And we've got a colleague from this continent, from Uganda, Ivan Muguluzi, who's talking about the kind of pacification attempts that you find in Uganda to try and get people to not really act, or Ugandans not really to act as citizens, but more as subjects, to be there at the beck and call of the leaders of the country. So the UWC launch featured Liberty Matthijsse on queering democracy in Africa. That's an important chapter for us, with 4 authors adopting a bit of a different approach in the sense that they are in conversation with one another. Karen van Marle, who's looking from a more philosophical point of view at democratic futures through a feminist lens. And then Samantha Waterhouse on the challenge of accountability in relation to our parliament and our legislatures. And then also last week in Johannesburg, we had a launch with my co-editor Sipiwe Dube, and on the question of, he was speaking on his chapter on the question of black conservatism, which is a phenomenon that we need to make much more sense of now, for example, with the rise of the MK party. Hlengiwe Ndlovu speaking to the question of Nkululeko and people's expectations. This is really based in fascinating research on the ground of people's expectations of democracy, and how they say that we didn't fight for democracy, we were actually fighting for Nkululeko, which translates from isiXhosa as freedom. I think that's the most approximate word. So very, very interesting chapter that to take note of. And then Richard Levine on one of the most vulnerable groups in our country, namely labour tenants. And I'm very happy to say that we've got the co-author on that chapter with us this evening, Dr. Mqobi Ngubane. Yeah. And Nkosana Sibuye spoke on political economy. I'm just giving you a bit of a sense, giving you a bit of a taste of what else is in the book. And Monica Tebengwa, who's with the United Nations Development Programme, speaking again on queering democracy in Africa. But this evening, let's fast forward to right now. I'm very, very happy to have a wonderful group of another wonderful group of our authors with me. Firstly, Professor Isaac Kambule, who's based at WITS. Very welcome to you, Isaac. And Kobe, I can't welcome you because you're all based in Gqeberha. You're at Nelson Mandela University, but I'll welcome you to this evening. Very happy to have you here. And Zukiswa Kota, who's at Rhodes University with the Public Service Accountability Monitor. And they will tell us more about their chapters shortly. So I want to just share with you a few thoughts around what you can expect in the book. As I've mentioned, we've got a very varied group of authors, from the rest of the continent, from elsewhere in the world, but also mostly from South Africa. So it's really bringing South Africans into conversation with people elsewhere. We've got 4 sections in the book: democracy, accountability, and the law. We've got practices of democracy and the politics of identity, political culture and the economy, and then we end off looking at democratic futures to try and make sense. You know, how can we, in a sense, rethink democracy in a way that will reanimate this very powerful human idea, which is not a very old idea. We have to just remind ourselves that democracy is a rather recent experiment in human history. It's plus minus 200 years old, and we argue very much in our opening chapter, myself, Sipiwe Dube, and Zweli Jolobe, that basically we are busy with a continuing effort over the past 200 odd years to try and extend and deepen democracy, from the original idea of democracy actually really being limited to only a certain group of people who looked in a particular way and who had a particular class position, to really extending it through anti-colonial struggles, anti-racist struggles, anti-patriarchal feminist struggles, therefore, workers' struggles, queer struggles. These are the struggles that have actually been expanding the horizons of democracy magnificently, I would say, over the past many decades. And so we very much are arguing for the fact that democracy in itself is not the problem, as some authoritarian-leaning leaders are trying to convince us of. Welcome, welcome. Please come in. Grab a chair. Democracy is not the problem. In fact, we have to be very alert to the kinds of rhetoric that's being used to try and delegitimize democracy and trying to convince people to actually give up their right to choose who gets to lead them. Because ultimately, as we say in the chapter, democracy is certainly what one could say is the least worst system. So it's definitely not perfect. It's not wonderfully functioning at most of the time, and that's why we've got so many different models. Also, if you look at from representative democracy to participatory democracy to deliberative democracy and so forth, so many different theorizations to try and think how can we really make democracy work better, include more people, give more people voice and power. So there's been lots of activism around that, lots of theorizing, lots of trying to make sense of how we can really animate this powerful human idea. And against that, we've got authoritarian leaders, we've got opportunistic, what we referred to work by Brian Levy in a study where he's comparing the United States with South Africa, ideational entrepreneurs who are quite opportunistically trying to present democracy as problematic in itself. And we take it to the whole question of economic inclusion, socioeconomic inclusion, the importance of socioeconomic inclusion. And you can see that where democracy is actually in trouble, which is just about everywhere, is because you've had a massive heightening of socioeconomic inequality across the globe. And you are seeing how people are trying to make sense of this exclusion that they're experiencing in a very material and real way in their lives on a daily basis. And you've got these ideational entrepreneurs, these opportunistic politicians, and their hangers-on in certain other sectors, who are trying to communicate that you should just actually leave it over to the leaders. The leaders in their wisdom can actually solve this. A strong leader can lead you to I don't know, the promised land, nirvana, whatever. Take your pick. So and I think that is what we're up against, and it takes, I think, it takes quite a bit of intellectual courage and also some serious activism to actually challenge these kinds of discourses that are particularly coming from populist radical right sources, but as I say, also from leftist sources. So we're very happy. I just want to draw your attention to the cover of the book. It's featuring a beautiful painting by an artist here in South Africa, Ricky Diallo. He's being represented by the Everard Reed Gallery, and he graciously agreed for us to use this wonderful image. And for me, it really captures these tumultuous times that we are in, the sense of foreboding and the kind of the darkness that's upon us. But also, the collectivism of democracy. But if you also look at the image on the book, you can actually see that each of these people are also individuals in their own right. And I think that is that balance that one wants to strike in the democratic system. You've got the collectivism, but you also have that respect for the individual in their own right. Without further ado, let me, at this point in time, hop over to Isaac to tell us more about your chapter, where you are basically arguing that it is indeed possible to bring constitutionalism and connect it with developmentalism, one could say. And you are actually arguing against this discourse that we have, this anti-constitutionalism discourse. And you are bringing in the material argument very strongly. So looking forward to hearing from you, Isaac.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that particular introduction, and good evening to all the colleagues that are joining us here and those who are online. So in relation to my chapter, I recall when I wanted to write it, it took a lot from me, because it was a particular time whereby it was around 2020, if I'm not mistaken, or before 2020. So I wanted to write more about the idea of developmental state, because we often talk about them, but in terms of bringing the core issues and the core capacities that are needed to create a state that is going to be capable to deliver services, that has been one of the key things that we are missing. In as much as the National Development Plan talks about such particular features that are needed, but we've seen over the last 10 years that we have only regressed in terms of the developmental achievements that we wanted to achieve by 2022 and as we are going to 2030. So the idea, again, if you look at the chapter, the title is In Search of a Constitutional Democratic Developmental State. So in most cases, when people talk about developmental states, they often think of authoritarian regimes. Wherever you go, they say, oh, you want to be an authoritarian regime. You want to be like China, you want to be like what South Korea was at that particular point. You want to follow the roots of these many other states. But over recent years, there's been emerging literature that has been focusing on the idea of democratic developmental state, not only in the global south, but as well as based on the key lessons that could have been learned from the Scandinavian countries. So in that particular sense, then the idea came that based on the South African Constitution, and against the wave and backlash that we had against the South African Constitution for a prolonged period, I realized that there was a particular opportunity to contribute to the ongoing debate about the role of the state and the Constitution. Because in most cases, it is framed as if the state is, or the Constitution is anti-transformation. But if you go to the very basis of what the Constitution states, it gives the state the necessary directive to say, utilize everything that you have, utilize your structural component based on the structure of the state to attain particular developmental objectives. Utilize the administrative power that you have in terms of collecting taxes, that you have in terms of development finance institutions, in order to be able to respond to the social ills that South Africa is facing. But what we have seen then is a particular narrative whereby the state will fail to deliver services and then go back and say the problem is the Constitution. And in most cases, there's only one particular chapter or clause within the Constitution that they blame. It's always Section 25 of the Constitution. But it can't be that everything that you do is related to that. I'll make a particular example in terms of delivering services. The issue of giving people basic services is enriched or enshrined in the Constitution. But the governments, in most cases, can be local, it can be national. They are failing to deliver particular services, and they will go back and say the Constitution is stopping me. The very same Constitution that is compelling you to go and eradicate pit toilets in most schools, whether it can be the Eastern Cape or anywhere else. And then, if you are trying to marry the two, you often see that there's no particular merits that people have. As I've indicated, aside from the most debatable issue of Section 25, of which we've had some of the leading authors again, such as the likes of Nguraitobu, who have written extensively and indicated that the issue of expropriation is not an issue of compensation or anything. The state has the necessary power. Sometimes it can be an issue of political will. So in this particular narrative, what then I tried to do was then marry the idea of South Africa, despite its many failures, as an element that can show you what the Constitution does in terms of providing the states with the necessary ambits of the structural component and as well as the administrative component to say, I'm giving you the foresight to become a developmental state that is at the epicenter of addressing some of the social ills that we face in the country. I mean, you can go to constitutions such as the US. The role of the state is not prominent in such constitutions because, again, it's based on a libertarian system, but it's about individualism rather than what the state can give. And in the South African context, we often take a view that because of the emphasis on individual rights, then again, it also inhibits certain particular developments that we want to undertake. But again, as I've indicated, if you trace the entire history, you end up realizing that there have been only a few instances where you can rightly point out and say these are some of the fundamental issues that we are facing. And as I've indicated, you can go to cases again here in Eastern Cape, in KZN, in terms of what we have with the issues of land, in terms of Ingonyama Trust. You can go back to much of the contested case here again in the Eastern Cape in terms of the mining rights, and all of that again shows you particular instances whereby the Constitution has been at the mercy of the poor. And in this particular case, those who are failing, who are in power, who are failing to deliver particular developmental mandates are often blaming the Constitution. So then what I did is, within the chapter, was then to take the ideas of a written and unwritten social contract. So if you go to countries such as Taiwan, there's a particular unwritten social contract that says we agree as the people that the state is supposed to be at the epicenter of driving development for us. But that particular unwritten constitution for us can be in the form of a written constitution, because you have it in our constitution in terms of it being able to direct the state in terms of what it is supposed to do. Whether it can be within local government, saying local government are supposed to deliver social and economic services to the people that are supposed to be at the forefront of development planning. In most particular instances, as I've indicated, those are particular prescripts that are often not found within some of the constitutions across the globe. But as I want to close off, there's one particular thing that I'm trying to marry within the chapter. So it is the idea that your developmental state, as most people are writing about the democratic developmental state, you can use South Africa as a basis of a constitution that is promoting a democratic developmental state, and thereby it extends the current debates that we're having as to whether developmental states need to be authoritarian or not, because the state is giving you the legitimacy to use democratic rights in order to achieve the kind of development that you want to see. Thank you so much.
Well, that was actually way quicker than you were supposed to be. Oh. So thanks for that. So, and tell me a bit more about, you know, what inspired you to write this, and how do you think I mean, it's clear what the implications are for democracy. That's one of the things that we were trying to think through in terms of getting different angles on how do we understand the strengthening of democracy. But if you want to say a bit more about this relationship between development and democracy.
No, thank you so much. And again, in relation to that, I think that's one of the greatest debates that we're having as to whether democracy could lead to the kind of development that people want. And I will start off by indicating that I mean, we need to admit that we are facing certain issues in the South African context, whether it could be the issues of the land and many other things. But in this particular case, it's also about how do we then utilize our developmental rights or our democratic right to ensure that we can achieve a particular development. And in this case, we can necessarily say that within the South African context, we've seen many failures in terms of people being able to exercise their democratic rights, but at the end of the day, it depends on who is at a particular office. And then again, we must also be wary of certain issues such as inequality in terms of participation. There are those who have the means to participate and influence decision making against those who do not have the means. So that again brings about some of the contestations that we often see within democratic rights as to then who has more rights. Is it those who have or those who do not have? And in particular cases, as I've mentioned, in certain communities, if it is not for those who have, in particular cases, who can fund NGOs, who can fund particular, who can basically pay for particular lawyers to represent those who do not have, and then it basically means that the democratic rights of those that do not have can be trampled. And in that particular case, we often see then a rise of people who are disgruntled by some of the democratic processes, because in as much as they can give their or voice their grievances, it can be the case that they do not necessarily have the power to change some of the legislations that we have, and as well again as that goes back to the kind of leadership that you often have in place. Because if you have leaders that are not willing to listen to the citizens, then the issue there is not the issue of democracy or development. It's just an issue of a particular leadership that is unable to listen and as well as deliver particular developmental mandates. And I think one of the key points again that we also need to focus on in that particular debate is the idea of the neoliberalized component in the South African context. And I've often said one thing, that if the government is failing to deliver, they are in power. If they want to turn around the tide and say we want to move away from a neoliberal structure, they can go ahead and do that. It's about political will rather than democracy not working. So at the end of the day, it is political leaders, it is us as the masses that are going to make democracy work, not the other way around. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. And this brings in an important theme, I think, for us in the book around neoliberal capitalism and the effects of neoliberal capitalism actually on the truncation of democracy. And this is something that we see worldwide, but we also see that in South Africa. So, but I'm sure we'll take this further in our Q&A session. And I want to follow up with Zukiswa Kota, who's, as I said, with the Public Service Accountability Monitor. So you're not, this is not really an NGO, but this is an entity inside Rhodes University, and you are actually doing this kind of research and advocacy also in terms of strengthening people's voices in relation, well, to demand accountability actually from politicians. So, but tell us more about that. But firstly, jump into your chapter. Tell us about what you are, the kinds of insights that you are providing us with around corruption and how corruption also impacts development and particularly affects poor people. Thanks.
Thanks, Christy. And yeah, thanks for this evening and the chance to chat to everyone. Public procurement and corruption are probably the least exciting topics in this book. So I'll try to see what I can do with that. But having said that, you know, public procurement is on the one hand quite a dry and sometimes quite intimidating area of work, area of advocacy, area of accountability. But it does touch every single aspect of our lives. And I think in particularly the question around a developmental state, what are those links? And so I really, I think I'll maybe take the, what is it when you're on the baton? Yeah. And maybe reflect a little bit on what is in the chapter and why procurement and why it is that we should pay attention to it. Maybe as a starting point, driving from Makanda this way, I tried to make a note of some of the, sort of illustrative things for why procurement is important. So first of all, I woke up with my fingers crossed that, when I turned on the shower, there'd be water coming out of the tap. And there was, thankfully, so you're lucky. Not smelling you up. But no, so that was one immediate thing. And one of the elements of that, and I think it's now a nationwide issue, very linked to procurement. In this instance, one of the layers of that is the dysfunction or otherwise, or functioning or otherwise of the water treatment works. At last count, one of the main sort of water treatment works in Makanda had, a cost of about 110 million rand, which in the bigger scheme of things isn't a lot of money, but in the context of our space, where it does mean the difference between water and no water, clean water or E. coli infested water, sick children or otherwise, it is a massive deal. And that's another sort of really fundamental aspect of how it is that, public procurement systems touch our lives daily, and why it is we have to get it right. And in particular, why it is the questions around, environments that are enabling to corruption, environments that are enabling for procurement to be sort of upturned and those systems to be turned upside down, need to be questioned. Another sort of observation was, I think potholed roads are something that all of us sort of live with now. And the decisions, so even coming off of the Rhodes University campus and taking a note of some of the potholes, and I'm hoping not too many of my colleagues are, listening to this, but certainly like the decisions around, filling potholes with sand, river sand versus whatever it is they should be filled with in order for them to be maintained better, the contractor that does that, how much that contractor is paid, is it, what are the decisions behind all of that? So as a resident, am I able to immediately say, right, contractor X has done this, and this is the service level agreement they worked against or didn't work against? Those are kind of fundamental questions that in an opaque system just, don't enable us to ask the right questions, even if we are in the participatory spaces that we should be in. So maybe those are just, some of the kind of direct elements, and water and infrastructure being those kind of key ones. But maybe to kind of come back, and I did make it a point, make it a point to write down my notes, otherwise we'll be here all night. There were, just in terms of the chapter, the link between procurement and democracy is not a tenuous one. But I do think that even as civic actors who are trying to build accountability in the procurement space, it isn't always something that we come back to and place emphasis on. And perhaps that's one of the things in the chapter that I've tried to sort of say, is that it isn't just about public administration working or not working, corruption or not corruption. It is actually, those are fundamental bread and butter issues that all of us should be concerned with. The sort of unique, perhaps, I'll use unique loosely, the unique aspect of public procurement in South Africa is also that it carries the very sort of developmental objectives. It is, because of its massive potential and its purchasing power, has the potential to kind of address the issues of inequality, address the issues of poverty and unemployment, and in particular, questions of inclusion. The president, for instance, in 2019 committed to having, to ensuring that 40% of those that are doing business with the state are women or women-owned businesses. I'm not sure where that's at, but certainly the road trips have fizzled out. So it would be good to return to that and better understand in the current procurement system what is actually happening in terms of inclusion, and in particular, addressing issues of unemployment. And so, yeah, if for no other reasons, the principles that sort of tried to highlight in the chapter is firstly, again, that procurement is a potentially, and we say potentially because it's just nowhere near where it should be, but it's a potentially powerful mechanism that the state can use to more meaningfully, move towards an equitable service provisioning. And I'm taking for granted a lot of the service delivery elements. So to some extent, I think we're maybe nudging each other in this regard. But to drive towards a thriving, inclusive economy. So, for instance, the national health, the NHI is really top of mind right now, and it's something that we're all talking about. Procurement there is central. And we cannot, I think a lot of people have sort of stepped up to really, to some extent, raise the alarm. And we previously made some submissions to really emphasize the need to get the procurement system right. Otherwise, the NHI is if anything, will likely kind of move us backwards in terms of procurement, at least. Similarly, in the context of school infrastructure, again there, I think the example set by many civic actors is clear around why it is school infrastructure procurement as one element is fundamental. Locally led, locally driven food production, food provisioning, for instance, to supply the school nutrition program, which sadly is something that many families, many households, many children are heavily dependent on. Again, procurement there is central. The school nutrition program in KZN, for instance, is under the microscope. Some children, some learners, that is the only meal they actually get in the day. But if the procurement of fresh food and produce isn't done right, again, they're fundamental knock-on in terms of vulnerable households, vulnerable children. The second aspect is that, again, given its massive reach, this is something I go into the chapter quite a bit. Given its massive reach, procurement is also a corruption hotspot, and I think again we all have examples of that, both small and large. Some estimates place the cost of corruption, beyond the trillion mark. And if you really in the most recent years, but if you consider that the current, the entire national budget in the current financial year is just over R1 trillion, that should really just, raise the alarm and raise our hackles. So I think the other point of emphasis is also that actually it's difficult to estimate what the actual cost of corruption is. It's the cost of livelihoods. It's the cost of vulnerable, vulnerable households' well-being. And I think many commentators, many researchers who've worked and done this are also saying, we don't know how much corruption is actually costing this country in any real sense. So these are estimates, and I think again that's something that the chapter tries to go into. The third aspect, almost there. The third aspect is that the current procurement system, in addition to being overly fragmented and overly complicated, also permits undue powers, or rather the circumventing of processes, procurement and supply chain processes, by those in power, by the executive, by MECs and ministers. So the awarding of tenders, appointment of contractors, extensions of tenders, things that members of the executive should not be touching at all. And so one example is that of the Giyani water project. And I'd just like, just briefly to maybe, I marked the page of the Giyani bulk water project. And for those, I think Limpopo is comparable to the Eastern Cape in as far as really dismal service delivery, issues of water, unavailability, issues of water, poor water quality. And so Giyani, I think, is front of mind for many. The Giyani Water Infrastructure Project illustrates the recurring risks within current procurement processes and the often hidden social costs and trade-offs. So it was started by the Department of Water and Sanitation as an emergency drought intervention in 2009. The project has been the subject of various court challenges, investigations, and delays. By 2019, the project had already cost 2.5 billion rand, which was massive quantums beyond what it had, what it was meant to cost by that point. So this is now 10 years later, and the costs have ratcheted up. The water project has not been delivered. Communities in Giyani still at that point, 10 years into the project, have not received water. We are now 2024, 16 years later, 2009, that's 16, almost 16 years later. And some of us may have picked up in the news recently that Giyani is back in the context. Villages in Limpopo, in the Giyani area, have not received the water that they should have, 2009, 2016. Since then, contractors have been paid massive amounts. The Minister of Water and Sanitation at that point was able to essentially determine the appointment of those contractors, who gets awarded tenders, and essentially this issue of undue powers continues and has continued, or certainly had at that point, had a direct bearing. So where are we now? Have things changed in the context of procurement? The answer then is, leads me to my fourth point, which is that where we are now, and by the point at which this chapter was being written, we were providing submissions around the public procurement bill. On the one hand, very excited. It's an opportunity for reform, to change the system that very clearly is not working for one that can work. And the willingness, and it was long in the coming. So between then and now, the current procurement bill, which has really seen lots of backwards and forwards, has gone through Parliament, has gone through the National Council of Provinces, and has seen many civic actors really give amazing inputs, thorough inputs. Some have even written entire, separate drafts of the bill of their own, those within the kind of legal space. It's gone back. There's been real robust engagement, but at the core of it is this sense that this is a moment for reform. It now sits with the President awaiting assent, but very likely going to see significant legal challenges, is my assumption, or is my take at this point. But again, a moment of real opportunity, potential opportunity for reform. So we'll have to see post-elections what happens. I don't think that much will move between now and the 28th, when the kind of proper formal, parliamentary processes must end. But certainly the procurement bill is one area that, from a democratic perspective, from a perspective of inclusiveness and kind of really anti-corruption work, is something that is fundamental and should be something that we, I think, all should be talking about, thinking about, engaging on.
Thank you so much for that, Zuki. And this links quite nicely to our conversation last week at UWC, because with Samantha Waterhouse, who's doing work on Parliament and the legislatures and the legislative process and the whole challenge of accountability. And we were talking about the monies bill process, the money bills process rather. And that's another entry point, where, for example, Parliament has got a lot of powers in terms of actually determining the ultimate budget, and which has not been used at all. Samantha Waterhouse told us that since the money bills, let me just get it right, the Money Bills Amendment Act was passed, I think, in the late 2010s, if I'm not mistaken. It was passed before. It was actually before 2010 that it was passed, yes. And since it was passed, they've never ever, Parliament has never ever used the opportunity to change one word in it, not even a comma. So this is again an important point of intervention if we're thinking about the problem of socioeconomic inequality, and we know that certain political forces have been driving this point home of that we've had a political transformation but not an economic transformation. But from the actual work that we're seeing from both of our presenters so far, much opportunity actually exists in terms of how our constitutional democratic system is designed to make exactly those kinds of very powerful interventions to enable socioeconomic inequality, to challenge and to battle against socioeconomic inequality, and that is actually not happening for reasons that you've also now alerted us to. But we'll keep on talking about this. But first, I want to hear from Kobi Ngubane, who will now speak to a group of people who were basically also on the receiving end of this kind of ineffectiveness of the democratic state, of actually addressing a really vulnerable group of people and their rights, and to empower them, and this is now after, and I think you're going to give us a bit of a sense also of the history behind this. This is really a legacy of colonialism and apartheid. Labour tenancy is really one of those phenomena that you can only understand if you analyze colonialism and apartheid, and you understand dispossession, and you understand super exploitation of black labour. So, Kobi, please tell us more.
Thank you so much, Christy. and thank you everyone for coming. So I'll tell you a bit more about our chapter, but firstly, I just want to explain what labor tenants are in the historical sense. So as the colonial project was unfolding, excuse me. So as the colonial project was unfolding, of course, it was accompanied by massive land dispossession. And one of the ways in which black people could hold on to the land was to subject themselves into a form of slavery called labor tenancy. At first, they were not paid. Sometimes they were paid in salt, and basically lived under horrible conditions of violence. There were violent relations. When they were working on the fields, they would be followed breeding on the leg style so that they produce the agricultural commodities. So those were the early days of South African capitalist agriculture. And of course, it transformed in many, many ways till this day. And of course, many people who were called labor tenant households have been forced off the land gradually over the past 6 decades, but more intensely over the past 3 decades. So I will be talking a little bit more about that. So I've just made some points on the basis of the chapter, and I try to locate it in the wider context of the land question in South Africa. 30 years into democracy, we've seen the uprooting and eviction of more than 3 million black people from white-owned farmland in South Africa. These people end up in rural slums, shacks and townships of mainly rural towns across the country. The rural hinterlands remain empty without them. They left behind land and family graves and all natural resources attached to land. The democratic government has been unable to stop continued evictions of black people by white landowners. This is unsurprising for the neoliberal policies adopted since 1994, which has consolidated white land ownership in South Africa. Today, a total of 72% farmland in South Africa is owned by white people. No more than 10% of farmland has been redistributed to black people, and most of this 10% redistributed land is under the control of white agribusiness and nature reserves under various unfair partnerships with minute dividends for black recipients. The greatest beneficiaries of the wealth of the land and all its natural resources are white elites, as differentiated as they are. The issue of reparations, land redistribution, and the attached wealth generation remains unresolved till this day. So, our concern in this chapter are the last remaining few millions of black people living on white-owned land in South Africa. We are concerned that only about 10,000 of them, only in KwaZulu-Natal, Mpumalanga, some parts of Gauteng, Limpopo, and Eastern Cape lodged labor tenant claims on the land they have lived on, worked on, and died on for many generations. We are concerned that the Western Cape province has been the worst in land redistribution and is currently the most notorious for farm evictions since the dawn of our democracy. And even in December 2023, there were reports of farm evictions from the Western Cape. And it's ironic that that particular eviction which occurred in the Western Cape last year, December, was pronounced by the Land Claims Court. It's a shame. Nonetheless, we are working on the 10,000 labor tenant claims thanks to the political mobilization of former labor tenant households, land rights and NGOs, particularly the Association for Rural Advancement in KwaZulu-Natal. The greatest outcome of these political mobilizations have been the appointment of the special master to fast track the 10,000 outstanding labor tenant claims. That is Professor Richard Levine, the co-author of this chapter, currently serving as the special master since 2020. His office has faced harassments by white landowners, particularly in Wakkerstroom, Mpumalanga province. They've also faced internal anti-land reform resistance from certain state officials in the land ministry. They've also faced a few other problems. The internalization on the part of state officials that black people cannot farm and should not be given land. Corrupt dealings between particular state officials and white landowners that block land reform. Extreme austerity measures that conspire to stunt and block the fast tracking of labor tenant claims. They need tens of millions of rands to execute their work. Such funds need sourcing outside the state in case they are philanthropists under this roof or anyone with the power of intervention. So we, and I mean myself and fellow academics, progressive lawyers, artists and friends, we've made an intervention. We are supporting the labor tenant claimants with research and advocacy. This is bearing fruit, evident in the publication of this chapter. We are also finalizing a documentary, a film, and an exhibition about labor tenant land claims. These creative artworks contain political messages that the last remaining former labor tenant households on white-owned land are actually farmers. They are farming crops, rearing livestock, and sometimes indigenous crops and indigenous livestock. Their farming activities remain blocked from expansion by the unresolution of their land claims for reasons named above. Furthermore, the film illuminates their current struggles and frustrations, such as the continued blockages of farm schools in rural areas, and also the blockages of rural electrification programs and other state services that stunt the deepening of democracy to their reach, all due to the blockage that the current white-landed elite have imposed on the democratic process of land redistribution. Therefore, the future we imagine is the deepening of democracy in rural areas via democratic redistribution of currently white-owned farmland for the eminent expanded reproduction of farming by black people as well. This utopia is also a spiritual one, to reconnect black people with their ancestral land, for them to regain their dignity, which has been stripped off by land dispossession. The land question, as we know, also extends to the natural resources question, such as the marine resources that black people are still barred from accessing 30 years into democracy. If you look at our coastlines, like our entire coastlines, like who has access to our coastlines, and all the regulations that are around that. So thank you very much. This is my contribution.
And Corby, I think just give us more of an idea of, so are we talking about people who are actually living on land, on white farms, who've got land claims on that land, basically, that the special master has been appointed to try and expedite? Because as I understand, there were I don't know how many thousands of land claims that just got completely stuck, and that's ultimately why the court then intervened. And this will now be controversial for anti-constitutionalists, because the court actually intervened in quite an executive way by appointing the special master for labour tenants to literally, I don't want to say force, but to move the state along, one could say, with these particular claims. But I think explain that a little bit more to us so that we can understand it better.
Thank you. Yes, there were originally around 20,000 or so labor tenant claims, and they were lodged till 2001, and they were lodged under the Labor Tenant Land Reform Act 3 of 1996. And it came to a stalemate. They were unresolved, they were lost, and people had waited for many decades since lodging them. And it was all suspicious. Why are we losing labor tenant claims? Why aren't we having good databases? Why lose such informative state information? And therefore people mobilized, especially the land claimants. They went through the smaller courts all the way to the Constitutional Court through the help of a local NGO in KwaZulu-Natal called the Association for Rural Advancement. And they had a major victory in court, and I'm really grateful that the Constitutional Court pronounced on the appointment of the special master, because we were stuck, and those land claims would have been probably lost forever. And now we are moving forward in the execution of those land claims. And we have a person who has been appointed, Prof. Richard Levine, who has been working in the state for a very long time. He has worked as a DG in various departments, and he has all the expertise and has introduced a new methodology in the investigation of the land claims, which essentially is about historical geography to gauge the totality of the land and the resources that people have lost over time. And that actually helps the labor tenant claimants to get a better deal, to get more land, because there is a discourse, a wrongful discourse in understanding labor tenant claims, that all that they want are residential rights. But our investigation shows that they are farmers. They want land for farming. They want to expand the agricultural production.
Thank you for that. So I want to, before we move to the Q&A, and I'm sure we've got many questions, people are hopefully bristling with excitement about launching several questions in the direction of our presenters here. Thank you to all three of you. I think let's have another round of applause. And I also want to acknowledge the Vice-Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University, Prof. Sibongile Mutwa, who's online, as I understand, attending our session. Well, never mind, much better than online. Alive and in the flesh, yes. Thank you so much, Prof, for being here. Much appreciated. So yes, let's move to our Q&A. Who wants to jump in first? Gary, I know you're already getting ready there. Yeah, chomping at the bit. Yeah. Do we have a roving mic that we can use? Great. And I don't know, Marco, are we able to feed through some questions from Facebook and YouTube? So I want to encourage our online attendees to please, any comments, questions, any observations that you want to lodge, just put it into the comment section or the chat section on either YouTube or Facebook, and we will read it out loud here, and we'll be very happy to engage with those. So, Gary, please. Just tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Gary Kukumo. I work on a climate project for the city at the moment, but have been doing various other things, including engaging with the local municipality from a civilian side on some of the basic services. So sewage, for instance, I understand that system now, and intentionally very well. That wasn't what I intended as a career. But so I wanted to pose two questions, if I may, and to the speaker on the question of corruption and procurement. When we look at our basic services, one of the key obstacles is procurement processes. So we work with officials who have a broken pump that can take up to 2 years to replace the pump, and very often have to appoint an external contractor to do the work because they don't have the capacity internally. In our water department, for instance, one of the key problems is that the fleet is not operating because the workshop is not churning through the trucks. And they don't have tires, and tires is a procurement issue that they haven't contracted in the people to do the tires. So the question comes around is that more and more I start thinking of the state system as a beneficiation system, and beneficiation thinking is of a greater problem than corruption per se. So when you look at procurement, there's an add-on, there's an inflation of prices. Simple things like toilet paper cost you 20 times the cost, and the delay in the system. It can take up to 2 years to appoint someone into the system. And I was wondering if it is that beneficiation mindset that is the actual problem, not corruption per se, that we've appointed people into political power that allow us to influence them in a way that was never intended originally. So I don't know if that question is clear. And then a very shorter question, but probably of greater significance, is I work in climate change at this point in time. Our country is going to go through fundamental change in terms of the weather, and that's going to shift everything from our economy to our land use, etc. And I was wondering if you'd given any thought to how democracy responds to massive migration, water shortages, etc., because the tendency is to go autocratic in those things, because you need something to be done, and how you respond in that way. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, Prof. Ngomezulu. Zanele, if you can, thanks a lot, Zanele, appreciate it.
Thanks, colleagues. Thank you very much for these presentations. I just want to check, Isaac, you indicate that our politicians use the Constitution as a scapegoat when they fail to deliver on their services. Now, given that the Constitution was adopted in a particular political context, which context has since changed, what would your view be when people say that it's time for us to review the Constitution? So that is the question for you. Sizuge, you say that there are these issues of public procurement and corruption, and we are struggling to address this issue. What would you attribute that to? In other words, why are we failing to address this issue? Because the issue is known. Why are we failing to address that issue? Government has failed to stop these land evictions, and the Western Cape is a case in point. And I'm glad you are saying this, because yesterday I spent 1 hour with SAPC talking about our politicians who only visit rural areas when there is a funeral, and then they also go there when on the eve of an election. Now, given this situation then, that rural areas are being neglected, and then you are talking about all the things you are referring to, a failure to address these land claims, what would you attribute that to? Is it the Constitution that Isaac talks about, or is the problem lying elsewhere? And then lastly, you say the future looks bright, and it's about deepening democracy in rural areas. Is that possible? If so, how do we address that? Thank you.
Those are a meaty set of questions. And John.
Thank you to the presenters. My name is John Mashaya. I work in the international office, but of course I'm here as a trained sociologist. My question, Christy, you did mention some of the findings from the article, I think it's by Hlengiwe Ndlovu, where she looks at the relationship between democracy and freedom and the disjuncture that's there. So if one was to insert a decolonial perspective, in terms of our understanding of democracy, its origins, and that gap that she has found to be there, in terms of inkululeko and democracy, and it being something, democracy being something that is not, of our own understanding and of our own making, and hence we don't understand it, then wouldn't it then explain why it explains the current state of affairs? And it's not only in South Africa. You look at the African continent and elsewhere. Isn't it something, does it then mean we've got to think differently in terms of how do we come up with a system of governance that everyone understands and then is then able to hold officials or those who are put into position, to account and also have consequences management? Thank you.
Thanks, John. Let me just quickly speak to John's question, and then I'll hand over to our other presenters. And you are also very welcome to speak to John's question and all the other questions. So let's do it democratically. Yeah. So I think the point that we're making in the book is that there's a misattribution of social ills. So basically, where people are situated, they are misattributing the problems that they are facing to democracy, while in fact the problem is actually about socioeconomic inequality and how that's been deepened through neoliberal capitalism. So one sees a kind of and I think this position is being actively advanced by politicians, not just in South Africa, but across the world, where there's an active advancement of this kind of disconnection between the actual source of the social ills that are besetting people, and then we're talking, if we think about the phenomenon of the 1% in the world, if we're talking about South Africa, which is we've got the highest Gini coefficient in the world, so we're talking extreme socioeconomic inequality that has worsened tremendously since 1980. So this is the era of Thatcherism, Reaganism, and so forth. A particular version of capitalism that's actually even more destructive than capitalism normally is. This is and it's a particularly anti-democratic form of capitalism as well. Neoliberalization is really about, it's a full-on attack on the state and on the rights of citizens, and on even the idea of the citizen is attacked through neoliberalization. And because you are turned actually into simply a little bit of capital, as Wendy Brown puts it. You actually human beings become bits of capital, basically. And everything is marketized. The whole society is marketized. You're no longer a citizen, you're a consumer, and so forth. And then if you can't consume, then you're actually superfluous to the system. And I think that the big thing is that that's why Marxist analysis can only take us so far, because Marxist analysis didn't take into account the whole phenomenon where the working class actually is no longer needed anymore in capitalism, where workers themselves have become superfluous. So in South Africa we've got very strong, or we used to have quite strong trade unions. Trade unions are in a form of disarray, at the moment, but we still have significant numbers of employed people belonging to trade unions. But the fact of the matter is, at the expanded definition of unemployment, almost 50% of people who can work cannot find work. This is structural unemployment. And this is actually how neoliberal capitalism has made certain people just superfluous to the system. And this is what, under Marxist analysis, as I understand, would be then called the lumpen proletariat, which is a dangerous class that that Marxists aren't very happy with. So basically the point is that it's not that, because I think it's actually, I've got a problem with the idea of suggesting that African people or people living in Africa cannot understand democracy or democratic governance is somehow beyond. Because if we also look at pre-colonial forms of governance, as argued by people like Mahmoud Mandani and so on, we had a mix of autocratic and democratic systems. I mean, the whole notion of the Grotla is a place of coming together where decisions are made, not just by, the chief doesn't sit there and just pronounce, hey, this is how we're going to be doing things, So I think the democratic governance has been part and parcel of the African continent for a very long time, for very obvious, well, perhaps not so obvious reasons, but after independence, in a number of African states, the argument was made that development can't be achieved under democracy. You need authoritarianism to actually drive development. In the end, it was just a very thin veil for predatory practices. Actually, if we read the literature, people like Ndlovu Gacheni and so forth. So I think that ultimately the challenge before us is actually to have a system where we, or not a system, but it's actually a challenge of activism. It's a challenge of politics, in terms of people actually understanding why hasn't my life improved. So the Nkululeko that Glengiwe is talking about, what she's finding with her respondents, and I don't want to talk on her behalf, of course. I mean, I can't interpret. I'd rather not interpret her chapter on behalf of her. But what we're seeing is this is economic freedom that has not arrived, and the reason for it is because of a very particular system of neoliberal capitalism, combined with that's become overlaid with a system of that's sort of driven by quite destructive forms of patronage politics, etc., imbued with corruption and so forth. So, and that's actually what's ultimately making it impossible for people to improve their position. And that's when you get these ideational entrepreneurs who are saying to people, no, the problem is actually not the economy. The problem is those people who are coming from north of the Limpopo. The problem is women who don't know their place. The problem is gay people, queers, who don't know their place. and so forth. Young people who don't know their place. So there's a drive to reinstate certain hierarchies and to distract actually from the actual source of the incredible misery in which many people find themselves in South Africa. We have to take into account that just over half of our population are now living under the breadline. So this is an absolutely unconscionable and shocking state of affairs in a country which is actually still, in terms of the global system, seen as a middle-income country. You know, there's absolutely no way that one can, in any way, try to justify this. And as people frequently say, we've got enough money in our system. We're actually gathering enough taxes, etc., to address the socioeconomic deprivation in our country. But there's an incredible level of wastage, and there's an incredible amount of money that's being lost because of what we've been discussing on this panel today. So I hope that goes some direction in terms of addressing what you were asking about, John. And let me start with Nkobi, actually. Let's do it the other way around. Nkobi?
Thank you, Christy. Yeah, Prof. Mngemwezulu, thank you so much for those questions. Maybe I should start with the first one, where you asked what is the problem? Is it the Constitution? To respond to you, Prof, I think the real creature that we're dealing with is neoliberal land reform that was adopted in the early 90s. So, Prof, as you know, the World Bank pitched up and they imposed themselves as advisors to our South African land reform, and they introduced the willing buyer, willing seller model. And that actually pulled us down. It tamed the revolutionary aspects of Section 25 of the Constitution in terms of expropriation. Even though the Constitution itself is a little bit problematic in such a way that it institutionalizes colonially determined land dispossession and says that land that was acquired during colonialism and apartheid should be protected in the new democracy. I think that is the downfall of that section. But the revolutionary aspects in terms of expropriation, they are very, very progressive. So what is wrong with our land reform is neoliberal land reform that was implemented since our democracy. And recently I was engaging activists who have fled Myanmar, and they are now based in Thailand. They are displaced people. And they asked me, what happened to South Africa? We respect Mandela. Mandela is respected all over the world, but the dire conditions that you are describing, what really happened? And my answer was, Mandela lost Chris Hani. I think Chris Hani would have pushed back against US-imposed neoliberal policies. I think the US should have left us alone to do what we think is right for our country. Why did they intervene in our land reform? And so, in terms of the future, Prof, I think it's great to be utopian because we are dealing with great frustrations, great blockages in the land reform. We are dealing with real wooden state officials who are black like me, who are blocking land reform because they have internalized the idea that black people cannot farm. Thank you.
Yeah, Thanks for the questions, everyone. I'll start, Gary, with your second one, which I quite like, and reminds me of something that perhaps we've been remiss in. So I suppose my academic background is in environmental science, and in the chapter I did try to touch on some of the other typologies of procurement, two of which being sustainable procurement and green procurement, another being, this notion of circular procurement. And I think in each of those, there are recognitions of the need to be adaptable, of the need to kind of move away from the conventional practices, which are quite exploitative, which are quite extractive, and are quite blind to exactly the things you mention around, sort of scenarioed planning where procurement and procurement legislation is concerned. I'm sad to say, though, that I didn't actually take that thought process into the submission work and the kind of advocacy we've been doing in relation to the procurement bill. And I'm going to take a step back and actually see, hopefully others did do that. But certainly in the earlier drafts of the procurement bill, that was silent. And I think that's a massive area, actually strikes me as you ask that question. And I think it is particularly, again, important when we talk about, vulnerable communities, but more broadly as well. So really great question. Your other question, also really great, really difficult to answer. I think the beneficiation point is a really significant one. I would say that perhaps it's both of those issues, both the kind of at the face of it corruption issues, as well as this, I like the way you frame that. And one of the areas where that I think for me is most pertinent has been in the conversations again around health contracting. So when we were looking at set price fixing in the context of medicines and procurement, that immediately is an area where whether it's about the right regulations set by the National Treasury or the OCPO, or memo land, certainly that is an area that requires direct attention, and I think it's something that likely in the current iteration of the bill is possibly not as strongly sort of addressed as it could be, but I think it's a solid question. Prof, on the question of why are we failing to address these issues, I think that, without, kind of returning to really, I suppose, stereotyped answers, and to some degree, I think, of course, there's the politics of it, and recognizing that political systems and the way, we've not had a change of, political administration since, essentially 1994, and perhaps there is a kind of deepening and an embedding of practice and embedding of I suppose turning upside down of systems. But what I would say is that even in the context where perhaps people are able to turn a blind eye or acknowledge the problem and do nothing about it, I think there are two areas where we can maybe be a bit optimistic. The first is this discussion, and maybe Isaac is in a better position to talk about this, is the professionalization of the state and those reforms that are underway. I think that's, again, really important work that likely in the conversations that are happening and in the broader reform space is fundamental to kind of beginning to answer how can we learn to act, to not look the other way when we acknowledge the issues. The second is perhaps something that also for me brings some a bit of energy, is the recognition on the one hand that even the most fundamentally sort of rigorous, robust legislation, whether we're talking about the Public Finance Management Act or we're talking about the Constitution as it is, there very clearly are still fundamental issues in terms of the human machinery. So an area of interest is where the Office of the Auditor General, for instance, is stepping up and saying, right, okay, there are fundamental changes we've been able to do in the Public Audit Act. It seems that there's a bit of tooth to our work that's happening here, but even in that, they're recognizing more needs to be done, and there's this notion that they're building around an accountability ecosystem. and recognizing that there must be collaboration beyond the state, working with civic actors, working with activists. And I think for me, there's something of that kind of kumbaya thing that is quite promising and can potentially, again, feed into the broader reform agenda. I'm quite hopeful, but so that accountability ecosystem and the recognition of its potential power, I think, is quite interesting, particularly from an important actor like the AG's office. So good luck to them, and I guess good luck to us. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's been thought-provoking. So my response would be precisely going to Prof. Ngomezulu. I mean, you've raised an important question, and last night we had an ENCA debate town hall at the University of Johannesburg, and I must indicate one of the candidates basically indicated that the issue of land reform is going to undermine South Africa's stability. And one of the key questions then that I had for him was, so if you are saying that the issue of land reform is going to undermine our stability today, why couldn't we think of it back then in 1994? To say, if we go ahead with this particular issue, it is bound to cause a lot of havoc for South Africa's democracy. And that's where the crux is. And Prof, again, your question goes back to what we had, I think, in 2017-18, where a lot of people were talking about a second CODESA for South Africa, whereby we could have these particular economic reforms. And in as much as those ideas are thought-provoking for many and are much needed within the academic space, I think as a country, if we fail to go to our constitution and then say, these are the particular issues we have with the constitution, these are the prescripts that are problematic, because currently, everyone that you talk to will go to section 25 of the Constitution, no other section of the Constitution that they do talk about. So then the question becomes, if we address section 25, of which we have to, are South Africa's problems going to be solved? Are we going to have a capable state tomorrow? Because as I've indicated, the issue of land reform, with or without the Constitution, can be dealt with. As I've indicated, in the likes of Nwai has written about it. But the issue is political will. It's at the end of the day, it's about choice. If you want to deliver services in a particular area, you will deliver them. If you do not want to deliver, you will withhold those particular services. I've often make an example within state-owned enterprises. Despite the mess that we see in most of these state-owned enterprises, no one within the state will dare mess with the Industrial Development Corporation or the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And they understand. It's a logical thing to say, if we do mess with these two, the entire economy is going to collapse. So let's rather mess with these ones whereby we've calculated the risks. So that's why I'm indicating that at the end of the day, it's about political willingness. You have, for example, political parties such as the EFF who have these radical policies. And those policies are about political willingness. They're not about the Constitution. You will hardly hear them talking about the Constitution, even outside of Section 25. They say, these are the things we are going to do, with or without the Constitution, and that indicates a particular political willingness. Well, as to when they get in office, are they going to deliver those or not? That's a different question. But for me, as I've indicated, yes, the issue of Section 25 needs to be addressed. But what are other fundamental things that we need to address within the South African context? And for me, one of the key things is based on ideological commitment. What are people in office ideologically committed to? You cannot have people in office who are going to be corrupt and they say, I'm ideologically committed to a better South Africa. That's a contradiction on its own. So unless we go back to such fundamentals and say we need people who are ethical in certain positions, we need people who are skilled enough to be in particular positions, only then are we going to be able, as Zogi has rightly indicated, the issue of the professionalization framework. And as I've already indicated this in various platforms, to say you can go to the local government level. They will tell you that, okay, we need to ensure that when it comes to planning, we have qualified town planners. But in other positions, we must ensure that we have our cadres there. And it's a calculated move. until a particular time whereby we are able to say we need to address all of those fundamental challenges that are causing incapacities within the state. Because I can definitely tell you, it is only through a capable state that South Africa will be able to grow its economy, because a capable state is going to support the key drivers of the economy. And without those fundamentals, we as a country will keep on talking about many things and clutching on things that are not necessarily the prime. But again, as I've indicated, I'm also saying at the same time that the land issue needs to be addressed, because again, it's also about issues of bread and butter for most South Africans who need access to that particular land to farm, and as well as to do many other things that are going to support their livelihoods. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much to my three presenters. Do we have anything from... Oh, good. Thank you, Marco. Let me see quickly. We are moving towards the end. So we'll handle these relatively briefly. We've got from Sita Yeni. Is that correct? For Dr. Ngubane. There is a growing narrative that there is no demand for land by poor black people in South Africa. Instead, people want jobs. What is your take on this in the context of labour tenants? Asks. That's the question. This is from YouTube. And then we have Eileen, who's asking, how can advocacy for democracy be prioritised in education, particularly the Department of Basic Education? In terms of quintiles 1 to 3 schools, overcrowded classes are still existing in 2024, and there's poor infrastructure. Eileen is also saying educators are not being valued and supported in these particular schools, and they suffer from a lack of resources. So I'll just throw this over to, and maybe a last question from the floor. Anybody that's got a burning, there's one burning question, yes. A second bite of the cherry is not. But we'll have refreshments afterwards, and then we can keep the conversation going. Yeah, but please. Please use the mic. Thanks.
Okay. Jean Wildervang speaking. I'm a contractual lecturer here at the business school with cultural intelligence. So, two comments. One is a comment and one is a question. To my mind, it really speaks to each other, the whole idea of developmental states offering a pathway to greater employment if we can sort out what was said about procurement. So, the one then kind of would help with sorting out the other. And in all of this, as well as the other speakers, we're often focusing on the leaders. What I often wonder is, to what extent do we need to really be asking questions about followers? It increasingly strikes me how actually docile and accepting the majority of our people are. A son of mine recently traveled throughout South America, and he said, you know, Mom, people get away with so much more. There would be riots and protests, etc., etc. Often when I think of just the street situation in Nkandla, in Grahamstown, Makanda, you think, why isn't there greater protest? How on earth does it happen that this is accepted to be able to deteriorate to that level without really a beep from anyone? So that's what I find quite fascinating, is the average citizenry, and to what extent does democracy start at home?
Well, I'll just quickly say that. Okay, there is a contradiction there in the sense that South Africa is actually a protest-intensive society. So we're seen as one of the top protesting nations in the world, and people have actually made the sums. So South Africans are indeed protesting. They're protesting about bread and butter issues. They're protesting about access to clean water. They're protesting about lack of development. They're protesting about all of those things that you. So I would rather beg to differ. You know, I think that we are. What's happened is that there is a kind of a disillusionment that democracy, i.e., in the most formal sense of just going to the ballot box and casting your vote, is not actually making a change, because politicians swing by, they make certain promises, they have certain policies and manifestos, etc., etc. When the election is over, it's done. I mean, I've been amazed to see in Kuberga the massive cleanup operation that's been happening here. Lines that have not been painted in 5 years, it's suddenly painted, in the streets. That's why it's looking so spiffy. I don't know, you must really enjoy it, Potholes that have been filled, that have been there for ages and ages, and so forth and so on, So literally, I mean, it's quite cynical if you think about it. Suddenly money is found somewhere. Suddenly the necessary personnel are found to jump in and to come and fix things. So there's a disillusionment, and that's why we've had such a mass withdrawal from the electoral process, which is very worrying for us. I mean, the figure that's been found in research is a 37% drop in voter participation from the first election to 2019. So from 1994 to 2019, almost 40% of eligible voters have just said not interested in further voting because it's not making a change in my life. And what people are actually moving towards, or have moved towards, is protest action, which is kind of a much more direct way of actually addressing the public representative and trying to get them to respond to your needs, but with I think massively fluctuating results. So let me not speak longer because we need to finish off, but we address these questions in the opening chapter if you're keen to read more. But let me hand over, Corby. There's a specific question for you, so if you want to jump in, and then but you can also speak to the other questions that have come up. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Christy. On the question about the emerging narrative that black people should be given jobs and not land, my take there is that narrative is kind of universalistic. It's like a blanket approach, and I think it is very, very problematic. So I think we should ask ourselves, who is pushing that narrative? What are the ideological standpoints? And what do they own? How much land themselves they own? And to what extent are their family histories embroiled in land dispossessions? Those are the questions that we should ask about the people who are saying jobs, not land. Why are they saying, let us leave land alone? Why so much interest in leaving land alone and focusing on jobs? Of course, we want jobs, but fundamentally, the land issue is still important. And for example, myself, I wouldn't say people need only jobs, because my own family history has been embroiled in losing land. And my own family history has been embroiled in labor tenancy, in slavery. So I want dignity for my people. And that's my ideological standpoint based on real history, on the real history that happened. And one last thing about this narrative. It says, okay, just increase the social grants and keep people in shacks. Would you live on 1,500 rands a month in a shack? The person who is perpetrating this agenda, would they themselves bear that life? Why then recommend such to our people? Are our people subhuman? Thank you.
I always want to weep after you speak. No, very, very hard-hitting. And I think to just a really, really brief point around the issue of protest or not protest, agree absolutely on the notion of disillusionment. And there's a small project that we're running in Makanda, working with residents and civic action groups called Action for Accountability. And the idea with that is to, on the one hand, support people's agency and activism, but at the same time, help to find alternatives. And I think many questions that some of those civic action group members and residents are asking is, okay, what else is there? What else is possible? But the disillusionment is very real. Then very quickly on the advocacy and education question, I think there is a great deal of work being done by activists, by organizations, the LRC, Equal Education Law Centre, who have done quite an amazing amount of work to bring to light, for instance, some of the failings in the procurement system in relation to education infrastructure. I think that those are areas of work that also need support and I think can do well with sort of support of regular residents, communities, and so on. So, yeah, just briefly thought to touch on those. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Isaac just had to step out for an emergency, so in his absence, and then to our other two wonderful presenters, last round of applause. And then I have to say I also want to thank our online people that have attended, and please share the link on, because this will now be lodged on Facebook and on YouTube. So one can watch it many, many times over. I won't force that on you, but for people who haven't seen it yet, it might be rather nice. And I want to invite Alan Zinn to the front. So we're very proud of the fact that the book is the first to appear with the new Mandela University Press. Nelson Mandela University has launched its own university press. And and Alan Zinn is the coordinator, and he will tell us a bit more about the press, plans for the press. And Alan, if you want to, I think you can actually grab Isaac's seat.
I will stand.
You'd like to stand? Okay.
Don't mind. Thanks. So thank you. Thank you first of all for being part of this quite engaging discussion. I must say it's been exciting being back, Christy, and thank you for inviting me. So I must say, with all the talk about land, it just made me think I've got a conundrum. I'm not a sociologist. I'm probably more of a historian, and this question about what is necessary at which point in time in history. So I had this question that I wrote down here: is it possible for non-democratic states to be progressive in terms of the moment in time? And the question I was thinking about is around like a country like Cuba at that particular moment in time. And we also have now a situation in the world where you have Israel that says they are a democratic state. But of course we know that it's not for the Arabs and the Druze there. But they say they are the only democratic state in the Middle East. And the others, Qatar, Egypt, etc., the UAE, all of them are not. They're supposed to be authoritarian states. But what side of history do people fall, and decisions taken? So just something that was going through my head, because in the book there's a very interesting chapter in the book by Rashid Butayeb. He's from Qatar, and the chapter is titled "Democracy: the Arab Malays and History as the enchanted past." So there's a lovely description talking about some of these problems there, but it makes me just think about, we are dealing with our situation at the moment here, but there are people in the world dealing with theirs. We understand that, I don't know, in Christy, do they say that it's like 40% or 50% of the world's going to elections this year? So it's really, how do we understand all of this? But just do a small sort of correction. This is the fourth book that's been launched under the press. We've been on purpose flying under the radar, I can say. We had two books that were, let's call it non-academic, although it's a difficult word to use that. It's being used by teachers in schools, two of the books. And then the book that we have outside as well is called Critical Social Work Studies in South Africa. That was the first academic book, and then yours is actually the second. And then just to let us all know here that there will be a launch of the press. The press will actually be launched in July this year, and Prof Mutwa, who was sitting there at the back, she and Prof Webb have a book called Achieving Nelson Mandela University, with the question mark at the back, as the launch book. There are about 16 sort of chapters in the book. Now, just about the press, we are, you can call it almost, a niche like press. We're not looking at publishing more than 10 books a year. Generally, there are 8 or 9 sort of varsity presses at the moment. None of them publish more than 20, in a year. We're starting off with about 5 or 6, and then we're moving up. And I think what is important just for us to understand is that we're working out of the vision and the mission of the university as an engaged institution. I like the emphasis that you had earlier, both yourself, Christy, and Becky, on research. And this press is definitely going to help the university to improve its, the profile when it comes to that. We want to encourage the postdocs, the early sort of career academics, and people in community also to publish. We speak a lot about this book that I've been reading is not only for academics and for students, but for organic intellectuals, for people in society that are interested in politics. So I think I'm just going to read you some of the titles of the books that will be published this year to give you a sense of the choices that an editorial team can make in terms of direction of a press. So the next book that will be published is called Theorizing African Women's Intellectual Histories in Southern Africa. Then after that, Pan-African Integration from Below, Language, Publics, and Culture. Then the one that we're talking about, the achieving the university, this one that we are in. The next one is called Tested by Fire, and it's on Neville Alexander. And then lastly this year, a book called Origins, and an investigation into Khoisan heritage sites and the sense of belonging. So that just gives you a sense of where we sort of going, right? But of course, I want to use the opportunity for us to to inform the country now, and the continent, and the world that we will be having a press. I want to encourage you, please, to ensure that this book is bought not only by libraries and, resource centers, but also in your faculties. I want you please to encourage your lecturers to say, let's put it onto the reading list, et cetera, because a lot of work has gone into this. As Christy said, I want to say thank you to you, Christy, and to your co-editors for how can I say, enabling us to publish the book. Because when you're starting at something new, there are going to be gremlins. There's going to be a lot of ironing out of things. So I want to say thank you to you, your editors, and the authors of chapters that you allowed us to do this. I think I'm going to stop there unless there's some questions. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think we will. Yeah. Okay. We will conclude on that note, and we've got an excerpt in News 24 today for if anybody wants to get a bit of a taste of the opening chapter before taking the plunge of actually purchasing the book. But otherwise, they are outside, and we do have refreshments as well. So please join us outside, and thank you again for being here this evening. Very, very good to see all of you here.